We're live. Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and welcome to my analysis on what's going on with Hong Kong, because I found out some very interesting things. And let me just say that I made a previous video where I looked at the demands of the Hong Kong protesters and described exactly why I thought they were both unreasonable and not severe enough in their grievances to actually justify a protest. But now everything is coming together. Now I'd just like to point out that if you hear some weird sounds in the background, that's probably a cat or something. So let's do that. So anyway, before I get in to this, I'm just gonna put advertise my stream somewhere. So let me just get everything good to go here. But yeah, as I was saying, for example, the main inciting incident is the extradition uh, issue with the extradition bill. And I'm going to be honest with you, that's a very common sense solution, the extradition bill. So it doesn't make sense to me why anyone would protest that unless they're maybe super isolationists, which they aren't, because Hong Kong needs trade in order to survive. So it's not as if there's some isolationism going on among the protesters. Because you might say, well, the extradition is with the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. Now, let me just point out that Hong Kong technically is part of the People's Republic of China, and Macau as well is also part of that technically. So it's not as if it would be unusual that this would happen, but still, it still doesn't justify it because it's an extradition treaty, or it would be an extradition deal that allows extradition only when the government of Hong Kong wants to allow extradition. And you might say, is that a problem? Isn't Hong Kong such authoritarian government? No, it's not. In fact, it's one of the freest areas of all of Asia. It's very classically liberal. That's why it's so economically successful. And so that's why it sounds so weird that there's all these protests going on, because it's essentially first world problems here. So let me say that. Because also over the special idea of an organization for oversight on the police is also something that I have a problem with. I just noticed that I spelled Hong Kong wrong in the title, so let me just change that here. There you go. Don't want to mess up on that. That would be very embarrassing to say Hing Kong. I wouldn't want to be known as the Hing Kong critic, as I am indeed a critic of the protests. So yeah, it doesn't make sense one bit. And that's why I'm going to read you this article, because I think this article really opened my eyes to what was going on. I already had some suspicions that something was going on behind the scenes, something more nefarious, that these protesters were, in essence, useful idiots for some more nefarious scheme. And I believe that this article pretty much points out that, in fact, they are useful idiots. So let me just post this here real quick. Bam. There you go. So now everybody knows to watch me. Oh, and so here you go. I'm getting some comments here. What was wrong with the Hong Kong protests? The extradition bill surpasses the laws in Hong Kong, which the PRC had given semi-autonomy with the British-Sino Joint Agreement in 1984, and the PRC claims to respect, whereby it will be taken over fully in 2040. That is true, but Hong Kong currently is not taken over. So if anyone's being protested against, it shouldn't be the Hong Kong government, but the PRC government. Okay, and it seems very silly that many people conflate the Chinese PRC government, which is authoritarian and lately totalitarian, with the much freer Hong Kong government, and they assume that criticism of the protesters somehow makes you in favor of a PRC, which it doesn't. What it means is that you don't have a problem, or at least a problem severe enough that you would say protest is justified in Hong Kong, which I don't think it is. If people are concerned about that, you can watch my previous video on that. But anyway, let's get to the actual article here. I don't want to muddle around. I want to actually get to the point. Hong Kong's opposition unites with Washington hardliners to preserve the U.S.'s own political and economic interests. Big surprise here. Of course, the U.S. is always having their fingers in somewhere. But here we go. While claiming to fight for self-determination, Hong Kong opposition leaders are collaborating with regime change neoconservatives in Washington to preserve the U.S.'s own political and economic interests. A new D.C. lobbying front has become their base of operations, by Ajit Singh. Okay. By the way, this is not a Chinese news source, by the way. Let me just be very clear on this. The U.S. Senate unanimously passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act on November 19th without any opposition. Despite loudly proclaiming to protect human rights, which, this is a little tangent, human rights don't exist, and democracy, a closer look at this legislation reveals the imperial agenda underlying Washington's actions in Hong Kong. And I would say that Hong Kong is probably the next Ukraine, because what's been discovered in the Ukraine is that the Ukraine had some government oversight agency that helped rewrite the constitution, which was of course, a branch of the Open Society Foundation of George Soros. And this isn't just happening in the Ukraine. This is happening in Chile as well, with a recent protests there, also backed by George Soros and the U.S. State Department. So it seems like George Soros is in collusion with the U.S. State Department to secretly work to overthrow governments around the world. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. This has been proven very openly. So this is all based on official information. I don't have the information with me right now because I'm looking at this article. But I would recommend that if someone wants to get that information, they did a program on The Blaze about this and actually gave out all the documents relevant to that. So there you go. The legislation is a long-term project of neoconservatives and leading Hong Kong opposition activists like Joshua Wong, a protest poster boy who has been present in meetings in Washington to develop the sanctions legislation since November 2016. Now, let me just be very clear here. The current Hong Kong protests weren't happening in November 2016. So it's very interesting that this is happening. So this is a long-term project here. In fact, the act was passed in the immediate wake of a lobbying junket to the U.S. by prominent Hong Kong opposition figures, including Wong. Okay. Meet with @Marco Rubio to discuss about Hong Kong human right and democracy. Of course, it's my senator, Marco Rubio. Of course, another thing for Floridians to be shameful of there. The September visit highlighted the opposition's close bond with Washington, as the National Endowment for Democracy, the engine of a U.S. regime change machine, yes, this is a real thing, recruited Hong Kong opposition leaders onto the board of a new DC-based anti-China front called the Hong Kong Democracy Council. Now, this is going to be very interesting at the end of the article when we get back to this. I credit Senator Rubio's unwavering leadership in demanding action from the full Senate for today's passage of, I believe it's Senate Bill 1838 by unanimous consent. Unanimous. That's very interesting. You'd think that at least somebody would have a political mind among the politicians, but apparently that doesn't seem to be the case. HKDC managing director Samuel Chu declared, while claiming to be struggling for Hong Kong's self determination, as we like to call it, democracy, the opposition is openly coordinating with Washington and aiming at nothing less than surrendering Hong Kong to the US's geostrategic agenda. And that's probably true, not gonna lie. Hong Kong activists and Congress push legislation to advance US regional interests. And this happens all over the world. This isn't a mystery. There's people that have been upset about this for decades, but it's it happens over and over again. For example, you've got Operation Timber Sycamore, which has been declassified to some extent, where the U.S. was sending weapons to rebels in Syria, of course secretly, without asking either the people of Syria in a democratic fashion or the people of the U.S. in a democratic fashion, which is an even bigger deal because the U.S. government is supposedly accountable to the people of the U.S., but if they do these covert actions, they of course can't be accountable to the people, because if the people knew about the covert actions, then they wouldn't be covert. So covert ops is a very easy way to get around democracy, because by the very nature of covert ops, you can't put them up to democratic decisions. But that's another story. As as part of an international tour to build support for the Hong Kong protests, Wong and several prominent opposition figures traveled to Washington in September to lobby Congress, of course, to take action against China. As Dan Cohen reported for the Grey Zone, Wong has been previously trumpeted in Western media as a freedom campaigner promoted to the English-speaking world through his own Netflix documentary and rewarded with the backing of the US government. Testifying on Capitol Hill before the Congressional Executive Commission on China, headed by neoconservative Senator Marco Rubio, Wong and others lobbied U.S. lawmakers to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. The legislation would amend the Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992, which governs U.S. relations with Hong Kong. The new act would direct the U.S. government to regularly assess and certify whether Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous from China. Now, why does the U.S. have to do that specifically? Isn't this something that you'd normally put up to the UN? Just saying. But there you go. Yet, according to the Act, the question of Hong Kong's autonomy appears to directly correspond to how closely the city toes the line of Washington's foreign policy agenda. Yep. First, the bill requires the U.S. government to closely scrutinize whether Hong Kong enforces sanctions imposed by the United States against North Korea and Iran in particular. Isn't that interesting? Isn't it interesting that, let me finish the sentence. Along with any other country that Washington deems to present a threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. Isn't that interesting? If you'd think that Hong Kong would be autonomous, wouldn't it be up to Hong Kong whether they wanted to trade with North Korea or Iran? It just seems very interesting that the U.S. is very intent on keeping Hong Kong closed off to countries that the U.S. doesn't like. Now, of course, there are serious problems with North Korea and Iran, but I'm just saying that if they want to trade with those, shouldn't it be up to them? Second, The legislation requires the U.S. government to closely scrutinize whether Hong Kong enforces U.S. export control laws and trade policy in relation to China, aiming to safeguard United States businesses in Hong Kong from economic coercion and intellectual property theft. Now, this could also be a way to stop people in Hong Kong from being middlemen for cheap trade between the US and China when there's big tariffs on China or something, which of course would make Hong Kong very rich if that happened. But of course, this prevents that from happening in a way. If the US government finds that such fundamental freedoms and autonomy in Hong Kong are being undermined, i.e., that Hong Kong is not sufficiently advancing the interests of US foreign policy, fundamental freedom and autonomy. Imagine this. If you don't agree with this other country, then that's not freedom and autonomy. That should be what freedom and autonomy is. Let's be honest here. They should be able to say, actually, Uncle Sam, we don't agree with what you're doing here. So maybe let off and give us some freedom and autonomy. That's what they should be able to say. But according to this, that's exactly the opposite of what they have to say in order to be free and autonomous. U.S. foreign policy in terms of sanctions against officially designated enemies and the Trump administration's trade war with China, the new act provides legal justification for the U.S. to impose sanctions on China. Okay. By working with Washington to pressure Hong Kong into aligning with U.S. foreign policy or face an escalation in economic warfare, the opposition has discredited its own claims to be fighting for autonomy or self-determination. In other words, what they're trying to do here is the same thing that they did with the Ukraine, essentially making Hong Kong a puppet of the U.S., a little vassal state, of course, which then officially is part of another country, which complicates matters very much. Indeed, its willingness to sacrifice the city's independence to Washington's imperial interests in the region has been laid bare. So let me just check to see if there's been any interesting comments. Okay. Oh, snap. A bunch of comments. Didn't the Senate House Democrats like Rudy Giuliani and the other guy in the Democrat and the neocon Republicans who is still advocating for continuing trade with China also unanimously passed the HK? Yeah, yes, they all did. That's the problem. It's a bipartisan problem here. Bill around this month, they should be anti-CCP, not anti-China. The Communist Party is the evil one, not the Chinese people. Okay, I don't know why criticizing the CCP equates to being anti-Chinese according to the CCP. Well, the reason because of that it is that way is because the Xi Jinping thought is that there is a communism with Chinese characteristics. So essentially, China is the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China is essentially a nationalist socialist country at this point because they haven't gone full communist, and they instead decided to go a more nationalist route. So they're essentially nationalist socialist at this point, not fascist as some people like to say. That's different, but there you go. The deep state wants everyone worldwide to hate the U.S., while the citizens are kept ignorant by the deep state, nor even support or can decide the U.S. foreign interests. I'm going to show that. For some reason, that got censored out by YouTube. Sanctions and tariffs would not work since it would only serve to strengthen ties in between the so-called anti-U.S. league. Now, here's the exact problem that we're having here. The problem is that if the U.S. wants to be popular internationally, then why are they going around overthrowing the governments of countries that are friendly with the U.S., like Hong Kong? It's just it's just very silly from my perspective that this would be happening, but it is happening. Uh, but we're gonna get into who's behind this in a moment because this gets better. Okay, tacitly endorsing lethal Hong Kong street violence. Now, I'm going to say that from the perspective of political philosophy, the state always needs to be able to escalate to lethal force at some point. Because otherwise, you could get a Gandhi situation where people can just break the law and then the government's authority is destroyed because they don't want to enforce their own laws. And that's a problem if you want to run a country. Now, if you're an anarchist, that's not a problem, and that's a great thing. But if you're trying to run a country, then that's a problem. So, so obviously, the state is going to respond with violence if the protesters become violent. That makes sense. And I will say that these are riots. I'm going to contradict the demands of the Hong Kong protesters that these not be called riots, and I'm going to say that these are riots because they are. Tacitly endorsing lethal Hong Kong street violence. The Senate legislation also exposes Washington's tacit endorsement of the increasingly violent actions of protesters. This is like Syria all over again. The Hong Kong opposition lobbyists have worked with Washington to strengthen the bill by removing the requirement that protesters be peaceful in order to apply for U.S. visas without obstruction. What happened to vetting Trump? What happened? We're going to vet these guys that are coming into our country. What happened? This, now, I know these are visas, so they're not actually immigrating, but they're just visiting. But still, if these people are violent extremists for a political purpose, aren't these people in some way terrorists in a way? Okay, I'm not saying that they are 100%, but if they're intentionally going out to be violent, I'd think that they would perhaps be classified in a similar manner anyway. This provision makes it abundantly easier for violent protesters to flee to the US, which is interesting because then you've got that whole extradition problem, which was instigated in the first place when Hong Kong citizens went to Taiwan and one of them murdered the other, and then Hong Kong couldn't extradite them because they didn't have a way to extradite them to their own country in order to hold a trial in their own country for one of their own citizens killing one of their other citizens. And that's something that I think they should be able to do. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Hong Kong always has the ability to refuse extradition if the PRC wants to extradite someone. So it's not as if this would give Hong Kong less power. It would give Hong Kong more power to deal with their neighbors politically. It would strengthen their independence in a way. Okay, Hong Kong opposition lobbyists have worked with Washington to strike. Okay, Sunny, I'm going to apologize. I'm not good with Chinese names. Chung, an opposition activist who testified before Congress alongside Wong, cheerfully declared that this strengthened version of the U.S. congressional bill was the achievement of Hong Kong's various lobbying groups. And this is a tweet, I suppose. There's a picture attached to it, but around 30 young protesters sit in one corner of a Polytechnic University campus in Hung Hom, manufacturing petrol bombs, while others cart them away to the front line. Petrol bombs! These people want to burn people. That's not a good thing, okay? Because it's not just that they've got shields or maybe clubs so that if they get attacked, or maybe they're throwing stuff, they're building petrol bombs, Molotov cocktails. You can seriously burn people with that. That's a weapon that many would consider a more mean weapon to use. So this is not a peaceful protest at this point. In recent weeks, Hong Kong protesters have murdered a 70-year-old street cleaner with a brick and attempted to kill another resident who disagreed with them by setting him on fire. Is this the protest you want? I'm just saying. Hong Kong rioters have used Molotov cocktails and flaming arrows and even developed bombs using propane tanks. This is full-on terrorism at this point. Shocking photos sent to CNN from inside PolyU campus show gas canister covered in bolts. Unclear if the canister has any fuel inside or could be detonated. Police Spox told CNN they are aware of gas canisters being used as weapons against them. By offering impunity to those who commit such extreme violence, Hong Kong opposition lobbyists and the US government have signaled their tacit approval of these ghastly tactics and many more to come. Now, I'm just going to say that that's not exactly, it doesn't mean that they're exactly approving of that, because I think many of the senators are being, in a way, used as useful idiots for this cause as well, in that they're not perhaps fully aware of the situation, and they assume that it's a peaceful protest when it isn't. But still, this is a problem. Let me check comments. Oh, snap. There's a ton. Okay. Okay. They might have not communist yet, but they're aiming for a communist state in the party agenda. You're a clown. Am I a clown? Okay, fair enough, man. I don't trust any authoritarian states like China, Russia, or the United States, a semblance of it. Now, the US is not authoritarian, but it is... if this deep state stuff continues, it might be, in a way. So it is eroding the liberties that the founders of the US had intended. I don't think China is nationalist socialist. Well, they are, because they have what they call communism or socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's essentially national socialism. And they don't have a collectivized economy. Their economy is sort of semi-capitalistic, and instead of directly centralizing all the industries, which you would have under communist regime, they instead heavily regulate their industries, which is similar to what the Nazis did with their regime. So I would say that it is in line with the idea of National Socialism more than it is in line with the idea of, let's say, Leninism or something like that. Okay. With their own organ harvesting facilities, with large Xinjiang concentration camps, while torturing their own citizens with. Okay. Facial recognition systems whereby George Orwell would have blushed. What the mainstream media forgot to report that during the early months of the Hong Kong protests, the police was brutally beating and shooting the protesters, and at the same time sending pro-Beijing thugs. Now that is true in a way, but I don't know exactly the context behind the beating protesters, because I think that if the protesters were being violent or they were refusing arrest or something, I believe it is justified to use force. I am a statist in a way. I'm not a fascist or a socialist in any way, but I do believe that the police does need to be able to keep the peace in the streets. But anyway, let's get back to the article. Hong Kong activists unite with NED and US regime change establishment. The opposition's symbiotic relationship with Washington was further underscored by the establishment of a brand new Hong Kong lobbying organization in Washington. The Hong Kong Democracy Council has brought leading Hong Kong activists together with prominent members of Washington's foreign policy establishment, i.e. the deep state, with the aim of pushing the US to uphold its commitment to Hong Kong's basic freedoms and autonomy and to preserve the US's own political and economic interests in Hong Kong. The nakedly imperialist language further highlights how far the Hong Kong opposition has strayed from its stated mission to preserve autonomy and self-governance. HKDC was launched on September 16th, 2009, with Wong and other Hong Kong opposition figures attending the opening reception. The organization features a number of prominent Hong Kong activists as board members. These include Anna Yeung Chung, founder of New Yorkers Supporting Hong Kong. Okay, not as if that's going to really make a difference in Hong Kong. But of course, this, now that it's a lobbying organization, sure is going to make a difference. Joseph Ng, a senior software engineer at U.S. weapons manufacturer Leidos, formerly known as SAIC, whose top client is the U.S. Department of Defense. You've got the military-industrial complex there. Samuel M. Chu, son of the Reverend Chu Yu-ming, a veteran and leading pro-democracy organizer in Hong Kong, who was the co-founder of Occupy Central that led the Umbrella Movement in 2014. So you've got the Occupy movement in there as well. In addition, the advisory board features leading movement figures such as Nathan Law, who along with Wong and other activists co-founded the political party Demosisto in 2016. Lee Chuk-yan, a longtime Hong Kong politician and member of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong from 1995 to 2016. Alex Yongkang Chow, former Secretary General of the Hong Kong Federation of Students following the 2014 Umbrella Movement. Jeff Ringo, chief researcher and standing committee member for Demosisto. Now, get ready, because it's going to go from 0 to 100 in a couple paragraphs here. This group of leading Hong Kong activists, politicians, and Demosisto party members advocating self-determination have joined with leading figures of Washington's regime change establishment. The Hong Kong Democracy Council Communications Director, Samuel Chu, did not respond to an emailed request for comment. The majority of the Hong Kong Democracy Council's advisory board is made up of members of the NED, the Open Society Foundations of anti-communist, that is to say, probably anti-Maoist, because he is some form of socialist. He's probably a Fabian. Billionaire George Soros. You get this? Open Society Foundations, billionaire George Soros, the Council on Foreign Relations, and Freedom House, which, if you don't know, Freedom House is diplomatically involved with the Department of State of the United States. So it is, in a way, linked with the U.S. deep state and with the regime change operations. So of course, George Soros is behind this, as no one would have expected. So let me just check on some comments real quick. At early stages, the protesters were not majority violent, other than any small instances. Now, of course, now there are people that are actually advocating for violence at this point. So that's what makes the issue a bigger problem, because if it had only been early on and then the protesters continued not being violent, but there you go. I would implore not fully trusting the mainstream media with a critique with it, since most corporations are pro-China these days to please the Chinese market, knowing that losing them will put them out of business. I know that what Freedom House is, and I know it is connected to Soros, but how they got their info is dubious. Okay. Here we go. So they're going to give us a little listing of some individuals here. Michael C. Davis, a global fellow at the U.S. government-funded Woodrow Wilson International Center And if you know about U.S. history and you know about U.S. involvement in foreign regime change, that comes from the days of Woodrow Wilson. And previously, I consider Woodrow Wilson to be one of the worst U.S. presidents, by the way. And previously, the Reagan Fischel Democracy Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, of course, the National Endowment for Democracy. Uh, Larry Diamond, senior consultant at the International Forum for Democratic Studies on the National Endowment for Democracy, and author of a recently published Russiagate tract, Ill Winds Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. So it's a Russiagate tract. So he's accusing Donald Trump of having been secretly backed by Russia uh, and by Russian interference in the election, which of course ended up not being proven. So it's these same individuals that are involved with the diplomatic establishment, which is working to overthrow countries around the world. So they're essentially trying to get rid of Donald Trump because Donald Trump does not follow their policies. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton does follow their policies, as was seen during the Arab Spring, which was largely exacerbated by the efforts of the U.S. State Department at the time, including Operation Timber Sycamore. Uh, and that's why Ambassador Stevens was in Benghazi at the time that he was killed, because of the ongoing Operation Timber Sycamore, which from because Benghazi was one of the ports out of which weapons were being uh, shipped. During the so-called Arab Spring, Diamond worked to influence the Middle Eastern and North African uprisings in support of U.S. geostrategic interests while co-opting progressive political space through now defunct projects like the Free Arabs web magazine. So it makes sense now that the opposition to Donald Trump in this sense. Now, let me be very fair here. I'm not actually in favor of Donald Trump. I don't like Donald Trump, but I think that at least in the respect that he's not in favor of all of these things is good. However, he still in some ways does fall to them in some ways. Sharon Hom, Executive Director of Human Rights in China, a longtime grantee of the National Endowment for Democracy. Hom testified before Congress alongside Joshua Wong and Denise Ho in support of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Jerome A. Cohen, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, which the Gray Zone has detailed, is one of the most prominent think tanks promoting U.S. foreign policy interests. Andrew J. Nathan, a member and former chair of the board for National Endowment for Democracy funded organization Human Rights in China, and a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. Thomas E. Kellogg, former director of the East Asia Program at the Open Society Foundation of anti-communist billionaire George Soros. At OSF, he oversaw the expansion of the foundation's work in China and also launched its work on Taiwan and North and South Korea. Now, let me just be very clear. Taiwan and South Korea are aligned with the U.S. Annie Wilcox Boajian, Director of Advocacy at Freedom House, which, as the Gray Zone has previously noted, is a notorious right-wing lobby group almost entirely bankrolled by Washington that is heavily invested in regime change operations against foreign adversaries. The tight coordination between Hong Kong opposition and the regime change obsessed U.S. foreign policy establishment is now undeniable. Far from righteous freedom fighters struggling for self determination, leaders of the Hong Kong opposition, have mobilized behind a singular goal of handing over their city to Washington's imperial agenda. Written by Ajit Singh. Ajit Singh is a Canadian based writer and lawyer. He tweets at Ajit X Singh. Now, I'm going to be very clear here. Okay? I actually suspected these things before I read this article. Okay. Because I realized that upon finding out about George Soros's and the U.S. State Department's involvement in countries such as Syria, Chile, and the Ukraine operating, and Libya as well, operating for regime change, as well as Egypt, although they didn't succeed there. Well, they did in a way, but then the military took over, so their plans got derailed. But their projects on regime change in all these countries, they follow a sort of similar pattern. Because here's where you see the Facebook revolutions, the Twitterless revolutions, the leaderless revolutions. Those are all terms that are being used. The implication is that this is just the people rising up. That this is a populist thing. That this is what the people want. And in many cases, it is the people rising up. But it's not the people rising up without some sort of instigation. And because what you see in the Ukraine is that you've got a third party oversight committee that then suggested changes to the Ukrainian constitution, which in a way allowed George Soros to have a pretty significant amount of power in how the government of the Ukraine was reorganized. Now, of course, George Soros was working in concert with the U.S. State Department on that. It's not as if this is something that George Soros is doing on his own, but this is something that is happening in Washington, D.C., among many of the politicians from both parties, and especially in the U.S. State Department. So I hope that the investigation on Donald Trump, because it's very close to these issues. It's actually very close to these issues. The investigation of Donald Trump ends up putting into the minds of the actual American politicians, the office holders, that there is something wrong here, that there is something that they should be opposing here that is going on. Because that is exactly what is happening. So let me just check on comments here. Okay. Woodrow Wilson was the world's first internationalist president, and Wilson's legacy was horrible. That led to the world being so angry at the US to this day. Their claims is dubious. For example, how did they know that the Soros was in Taiwan's pro-democracy movement at the same time in South Korea? Let me be very clear. George Soros doesn't do all these things by himself. He's got a big organization that does these things. So it's not as if he's personally involved in all these different things. Let me say, the Open Society Foundation has branches in very many countries. The US was not involved in Taiwan since the 1970s. That's not exactly true. The US is, in a way, protecting Taiwan, even though the US does not really acknowledge Taiwan. Because if the US were not protecting Taiwan, China would be invading Taiwan. So US does have close relations to Taiwan, but it's sort of similar to how the US had relations with Israel, where the US refused to acknowledge the capital of Israel being Jerusalem for a very long time for political reasons. But anyway, since they gave away the UN China seat to the PRC in 1972 under dirty, tricky Nixon administration. I believe that's Richard Nixon. Yeah, they did give it away, but the U.S. is still the primary force that is keeping the PRC from actually taking over Taiwan. Uh, because if let me just look it up real quick. Let's see, Taiwan. I'm gonna look it up real quick. I'm just gonna go on Wikipedia because it's very easy. So, uh, foreign relations, international organizations. Okay. Because the U.S. does have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, as is confirmed by the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. So, the long title being An Act to Help Maintain Peace, Security, and Stability in the Western Pacific and to Promote the Foreign Policy of the United States by authorizing the continuation of commercial, cultural, and other relations between the people of the United States and the people of Taiwan and for other purposes. That's the title of the bill. So it it is an actual alliance in a way with Taiwan. So it's not as if Taiwan is on its own. Okay. Similar to how the US is getting involved in Hong Kong lately, although it doesn't actually have as close ties with Hong Kong. But yeah. So let me just see. Yeah, I think Taiwan's relationship is bilaterally with the U.S., not in any particular uh, deeper sense with. It's not with NATO, I think. So it's in that kind of way. But anyway, let's see. Okay, there is no U.S. military bases in Taiwan, while Taiwan is literally defenseless. In the even if the PRC actually invaded, that is in a way true, but that doesn't mean that it can invade. Because if they wanted to invade and they went to invade, the U.S. would defend Taiwan. Uh, so that's at least the way it currently is. It might not be that way at some point in the future, but currently that's the way it is. So there it is. Because the U.S. is actually selling weapons to Taiwan. Uh, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, that is, the U.S. State Department. In July 2019, approved the selling of 108 M1A2T Abram tanks. That's Abram tanks, Abrams tanks, and 250 Stinger missiles to Taiwan. So it's not as if the U.S. Is leaving Taiwan out to dry. Unofficial diplomatic relations are nevertheless maintained on both sides by means of de facto embassies, which are technically private organizations staffed by career diplomats who are formally on leave. The ROC's de facto embassy network is the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office with offices in Washington, D.C. So, and the U.S. has the American Institute in Taiwan. So they sort of cheat in a way in how they do the diplomatic relation, because the U.S. is uh, technically in favor of a one China policy, but they're also diplomatically behaving in a way that counters it at the same time. So it's a very complex issue. But anyway, I think I'm gonna stop here at this point. I think I've said pretty much everything I wanted to say. So I'm just going to see if there's any final comments. By the way, if you're hearing it, about the comments at this point, probably too late to send anymore. Um, okay, okay. Internationally primary for trade, but the reality was that Reagan had thought that the Chinese would not attack Taiwan, while it would at the same time increase trade and etc. Yeah, yeah, but the U.S. certainly does support Taiwan because it's a important strategic interest, as it would allow for a great staging point to invade China in the strategic situation that the U.S. would want to invade China. That's also one of the other reasons why the U.S. maintains a military presence in South Korea, because not only does it have an influence and an impact on North Korea, but also on China as well, and that region of Russia. The U.S. essentially has a plan to invade any and every country in the world. Not that they're going to actually do it, but just in case they need to for whatever reason. So there you go. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Tell me what you think after this is done in the normal YouTube comments, if you've got any additional comments. If you want to talk to me on any particular issue, then please do. And I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltus over and out.